The answer, it is changing, and more funds that I see and interact with are taking different models. You look at someone like an Andreessen Horowitz, which is a relatively new fund, where they do a lot of similar things what we do in terms of business development for their companies, and they're investing at earlier stages and providing more support over a period of time to get them into the right channels. I meet with Israeli venture capitalists who have essentially retired from the business and have now come back and created these super angel networks because they recognize there's a huge pool of capital, but there's no organization. So it is changing. It's just, it doesn't happen overnight, and I think it's awareness and recognition that the old model is broken. It has to change, and as it changes, people make a lot of money. And that's what's going to entice capital back to this model, is that when people find more successful models, because it's not just, I'm going to throw 10 darts at the thing and 2 of them are going to succeed. It's a much more difficult model in this environment. So, I don't know if you'd add.
Yeah, I completely agree with what John said. I think part of what you may be seeing in the audience here is that venture capital is in the process of changing now. It's happening real time. So, and there's going to definitely be a change in the landscape. Some VC firms are going to make it, and clearly others are not going to make it because we've just heard that they're out fundraising and their LPs are not coming back. And without naming any names, there's going to be a different group of people, likely a smaller group of people that's going to be left insofar as the funds go. But it's definitely moving, and the opportunity, as John said, with the, of course, our portfolios that we currently have, the valuation has reduced, right, of those companies. At the same time, if we've got money, which we do, we can go in and, as the English say, hoover the landscape and collect a pile of opportunities at a much reduced pre-money valuation than we would have been doing 3 years ago.
We hardly seen any Canadian entities that invest directly in VC or VC models or new VC models, or even like us, a new super angel club, because we believe that the VC model does not work anymore. But because of that fact, because most of the money came from the US, most of those companies were aiming, when they talked about the North American market, aimed to the US. And that is why I believe Israel is listed maybe number 2 in NASDAQ. But if you check here in Toronto, which is way more appealing for companies, there's nearly any companies listing here. And the main problem is the markets that those companies addresses. And I think what you're doing is brilliant, and I wish there would more entities like you're doing that, but that's a drop in the desert. And the question is, how do you see the big pension fund or the big private equity companies here coming to Israel to found new entities that will invest in companies that would come here, that will look at their market here to base their operation here, and then in the next stage will come to the Toronto Stock Exchange, and people will help them bring a very successful IPO. So the question is about the pension fund and the big entities. If you could give a little bit of background on that.
As far as I can see, the venture capital community, as was said earlier, in Toronto and in Canada in general, is very sparse. And if government can help to move that and stimulate that, that would be great, as the Israeli government is doing in Israel. Moving the pension funds in, I think their first step needs to be to get over the risk profile or the perceived risk profile in healthcare investment. And to do that, maybe the first start would be for the pension funds to invest in some US-based venture capital firms that have track records of over a decade and a half, 2 decades of good returns, and then get comfortable with that and then start investing in Canada. Or actually preferably doing both, but that's my take.
I mean, the concept of Israelis coming to Canada is happening, but it's in some ways what I've seen it's happening through M&A. Is that Canadian listed companies are acquiring innovative companies out of Israel, which is an interesting dynamic. I mean, the way to get pension funds to invest is to prove that you can make money for them. To do that, there's been actually a lot of U.S. firms coming up to tap this huge pool of capital, and I think they're having more success. You look at guys like Bridgescale and Charles River and others that are actually coming into Canada and kind of bringing their expertise and their models, sometimes in a self-serving way in terms of how they do it, but they've been successful in tapping some capital and doing investments in Canada. I think there needs to be more of a platform for one, that the employees that are responsible and the principals responsible for investing are compensated along with their successes in investing, and so that the whole model kind of works and people are motivated to make more investments and to get over the bureaucracy and not so afraid of making bets and pursuing innovation in their own the way that they're compensated personally. And then I think the successes of funds that both are outside of Canada, investing in Canada, their successes, and then modeling that for investment into Israel and building a innovative platform for collaboration, because there is a community between the two areas, and from a technology standpoint, there's a lot of similarity in the strengths and the research organizations, and there's a huge amount of human capital and benefits that can come from it, but you got to be successful for people to want to put money into it. So.
Let me just give you my take. When I was at YISM at their conference, I was sitting beside at lunch, and I think Yaakov was there as well, and they put me beside Dr. Ofer. And I said to him, "So, doctor, what do you do?" He says, "Well, I'm the chief scientific advisor to the government of Israel." I says, "Great. Well, what do you do?" And he says, "Well, listen to my speech." And he went up and he announced at lunch, he had done it before, he announced at lunch that the government of Israel was giving $25 million grants to venture capital firms, either in Israel or in Europe or whatever, in exchange for two things. Number one, that they would raise $75 million of private equity to match the 25, so that was a seed. And number two, they had a demonstrated record of success. And number three, they would take that investment and invest in first stage pharma in Israel. Now, if the province of Ontario wants to do something, they could shut down one department of government, take $50 million and give it to two investment funds and create more jobs than the people that are on the private sector. There are things to do here. And we hope that in the course of it, we'll hear from Glenn Murray later on today. We started the dialogue last night with Glenn Murray, the new Minister of Innovation. But there are stunts that the government can do that are cost effective that will show a return to the government in terms of jobs. Instead of putting jobs in the public sector that are more competitive and more costly than the private sector, they should invest in these types of operations, which I think would leverage our taxpayers' money. There are things to do that doesn't make us dependent on government. This means that if Michael, for example, got $25 million from the province of Ontario, he'd have to go and raise $75 million to qualify. And therefore, all of a sudden, think of the leverage. For 25%, you get a tremendous leverage in terms of job and research. There are things to do. And that's what we're trying to do here, stimulate some ideas. Back to that question at the back, how do we get government to do the right thing that they were hired to do in the first place? Harry Truman once said, and I'll conclude, Harry Truman once said, he was asked, Mr. President, what do you do? You're the President of the United States. What is your job? And Harry Truman said, my job is to get people to do the job they were paid to do to begin with. So we'd like the government to do the job that they were paid to do to begin with, is to set up an entrepreneurial environment so the private sector can make money for everybody. Any other questions? And if not, I'm going to turn this over to Rafi. And I want to thank these two gentlemen. It's been absolutely a superb event. You've heard enough of me. The rest of the afternoon is in other people's hands, starting with my good friend Rafi.